Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will deliver the 2026 budget speech, making it his second budget under the government of national unity. Last year's budget speech became quite contentious as it didn't garner much political support, especially from opposition parties, with major dissatisfaction from civil society over the much-debated value-added tax. Former chairperson at the Budget Justice Coalition, Matshediso Lencoasa, writes that infrastructure spending is not reaching communities. She joins us now for that conversation. Matshediso, a very good morning to you and thank you so much for joining us. So we were speaking off air about how it was just, 12 months ago when that budget was rejected, but you were saying that South Africa is seemingly in a much better place and you don't see the tensions that we witnessed last year taking place this year.
Yes, firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity as always. So yes, that is true. The way it's looking economically, I think, and fiscally, we're in a better position than we have ever been as a country over the past, over the past few years. It's not perfect, but it is an opportunity to really resource some of those promises that we've seen in the SONA. So I think that the SONA is also reflective of that. I think the president reflected on our economy growing, maybe not at the 2% rate that we would like, but still better than economic growth that we've seen over the past year. Unemployment has taken a slight dip, and we'll also see we're collecting higher than expected tax revenue. So we really are in a position financially. It wouldn't make sense to introduce punitive measures like a VAT increase. And so we're in a better position. But in a condition, in a context like this, it's important that every single rand that is going to be allocated or collected in this budget speech goes towards rebuilding our public services that have been eroded. And it's ordinary people in this country who've been bearing the burden of an economy that has been struggling. And so we're really looking forward to this year being the opportunity for a budget that is passed, that is one that can restore and rebuild our country.
And I mean, speaking of that, you penned a piece, how Budget 2026 can build schools and clinics in our communities. How do you think that that rebuilding and that fixing of our infrastructure for people that need it most would also still feed back into the economy?
Yeah, I think, again, when the president talks about infrastructure investments in the SONA, and I think last year's SONA as well, just reflecting on turning South Africa into a construction site. When people think about infrastructure, I think they think about ports and rails and roads, which are very important, especially for economic activity. But the real state of the nation that people and ordinary people across this country really see is in our public services. And there is a double win, as you mentioned, that it does help the economy. Just social infrastructure is not a charity or a charitable intervention. It's also can build an economy which can in turn build a nation. And what that would look like is that we can go back to rehiring nurses, doctors and teachers who can then also, and building and expanding our public employment program so that we can have the millions of young people who are willing and able to serve the country, also participating and growing our fiscus so our tax base is not a tiny proportion of people holding a large base. So the opportunities to grow our tax base. I think that there's also an opportunity to also strengthen our infrastructure delivery, hiring the best of the best in the country, but also just planning and procuring in a way that actually ensures that every single rand goes back into the economy and goes back to communities that can in turn build an economy that works for our country. So there really is an opportunity to look at social infrastructure, not just as we have to do this constitutionally, but as a way to actually build an economy that works for all.
In your piece, you also highlight how projects are being announced before departments are ready to build. How can the government improve, especially on these project readiness and planning, in order to avoid delays and cost overruns?
Sure, and I think that was, when I wrote that was inspired by a parliamentary oversight visit that was done in the Northwest, where they reflected on, we are now allocating funding towards infrastructure, and underspending has gone down significantly since the post-COVID times, and yet we're seeing all of these millions of rands, but they're not translating into schools and clinics in communities, what's really going on. And so we realize that there is a lot of issues when it comes to planning. It's difficult to hold people accountable because there's a lot of acting positions, and the position or the person ends up, the infrastructure project is longer than the life of the people who are there to be held accountable. But also in terms of planning, I think that communities, when we do community engagements, that's a big question, is that our clinics are falling apart, our schools are falling apart, our children are learning in overcrowded conditions. Who do we hold accountable? And so I think that the piece was really just reflecting on interventions or opportunities to make sure that every single rand actually goes towards infrastructure delivery that can in turn build our nation and our communities again.
And you speak about community engagement, and really there must be an importance in the role of the community at the beginning of the process, not only when they start holding people accountable when things are going wrong. If you were to advise a community that would be involved in such an engagement, what is it that the community needs to go into that engagement with in order for them to be able to get the best possible outcome in that infrastructure, be it the school or the clinic that's being built in their community?
Sure. I think the first thing is ownership of the budget. I think that when people talk about economic issues, or what we've noticed in communities, is that the language that is being used is very disconnected from the ordinary experience in such a way that people would you'd be forgiven to think that it's not your tax money that's going towards this,
right.
But people are entitled to demand quality public services, particularly in an election year. So I would also advise communities, and we continue to do that, to be strategic, because now is an opportunity. The economy is in a better position than it's ever been, and it's also a time where many people will be making promises. And I think that communities have a lot more power than they've ever had to hold the state to account. So those are, I think, the mindset shift is something that I would highly encourage communities, but also to just not be intimidated by the harsh language, because any breakdown in public services, if the school nutrition program falls apart, it is your children who are impacted by that, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So I just really, taking ownership of the budget is one of the most important steps, and not being intimidated by the language, knowing that this impacts how, holding officials to account, and it starts with participating in the budget.
It certainly does. You also emphasize, when we talk about capacity building and state strengthening, you emphasize the need for the state to rebuild its capacity to deliver in infrastructure. What kind of skills and institutions do you think needs to be prioritized, particularly in Budget 2026?
Yes, so capacity is also one of those building a capable state, things like a tagline of some sort, which is promised, but it doesn't seem like we actually know what that looks like. But what it should look like is that we really need a state that's able to actually deliver these public services. And so over the past decade, there's been an erosion of public services. So I think even the minister conceded last year to me that there has been a reallocation of money from education and from health, or money that could be spent on our communities and better quality public services, to bail out struggling state-owned enterprises. And of course, I do understand why SOEs are like the role that they play in the economy, but also it is the ordinary South African in our communities who's bearing that sacrifice. And so now we're in a different position. But if we are really to build a capable state, we need to reverse all of that. And what that means is that we need to restore investments in our provincial departments in delivering quality public services in our municipalities. But that also means reinvesting. And so over the past few years, there's been a reliance on external implementing agents or external bodies. But I think that it's really important for the capacity to be in the state, so that we can hold the state accountable when an infrastructure project takes too long, for instance. And I think that now's the opportunity with a budget like this to really prioritize that, so that we can gain momentum in delivering a state that is actually capable of serving its people.
When you speak about gaining momentum, if we were to compare likes and likes comparatively to other growing economies, such as that of our country, who would you compare us to that have moved in a direction where they've invested that infrastructure investment within the communities, in building schools, in building hospitals, that then has seen a significant shift within those communities?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, looking at international, other country examples. And I think that we definitely have a lot to learn, even with our counterparts across the continent. So something that was quite striking to me is Rwanda, for instance, has a really strong gender-responsive budgeting response in the country. So recognizing that when there are budget cuts or when there are interventions, they don't impact everyone equally. How do they impact, how can we address gender inequalities, for example, in a context where, of global uncertainty? And what makes it so different, South Africa has made that commitment, but the implementation is a lot different. And what makes it so different, what we can learn from them, is that they are committed. So they have a funded commitment to doing that. So it's not just saying we're going to build a capable state, but they've hired people within the state in order to spearhead that, and people who can be held accountable. So I think that's just one example that I think of in terms of our fiscus, but there's just so many more. And I also do implore South Africa to also be a leader. I mean, we're always showing off about how well we can host internationally, but maybe this is also an opportunity to show the world what it looks like when we take our communities seriously.
And is this also an opportunity for government to gain trust again in the people?
Absolutely. I think that over the past few years, public trust is definitely eroded. I think even as I was engaging on the State of the Nation address, it was so clear that people just think political promises, but what does that mean in reality, especially when you have a budget speech that then paws down or waters down some of the promises that were made 2 weeks before. That is definitely something that's happening also in the context of the Madlanga Commission, et cetera, but really now is the opportunity to say, you know what, we've heard from our country, our communities don't trust us, public services are failing. We need to take this opportunity where we are making extra money from mining or windfall taxes and just really reverse that so that we can rebuild trust and in turn just rebuild our social fabric as a country.
So lastly, just with your future outlook, what do you then think are the hopes for how Budget 2026 will then transform the state's ability just to serve communities quite effectively?
Yeah, so I'm an optimist by nature. I think we have to be. I feel that millions of people across this country, some people have given up on the state, but there are millions of people who just cannot give up on the state because it's the constitutional body that delivers those constitutional rights that are promised and guaranteed to all. And so I really do think that with that in mind, that being 30 years since the Constitution, there's a lot of rethinking about what, have we been progressively realizing a South Africa that works for all? I think that combined with it being an election year later this year, we'll be talking local government election. It is time for people to see how much power they actually have, and there have been some hard-won freedoms and victories in ensuring that people can actually shape a budget that actually serves them. So it is obviously uncertain times globally, economically, but I am hopeful that if, what other choice do we really have? We really need to build a South Africa that works for all.
Matshediso, we certainly do hope that the Minister of Finance is listening to this and will prioritize that infrastructure build of schools and clinics, particularly in our communities. Thank you so much for penning this piece. It certainly is quite valuable, and for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.